Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. People in the U.S. military. What's the creepiest, most paranormal thing you have encountered during your service? Story 1. Humming Grave.
As a Marine, I used to have the late-night patrol shift at the Beirut bombing memorial. Part of the memorial is dedicated to a veterans cemetery. Strangely enough, I never felt unsettled being completely alone in a remote cemetery in the middle of the night, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. It was actually quite peaceful, to be honest. However, one night I was patrolling near the perimeter fence where some of the oldest headstones are, when I heard the sound of a woman humming. Intrigued, I followed the sound and noticed a light glowing through the vines and brush of a large tree. As I approached, I could feel my hair standing on end, as if there was an electric current in the air. I pushed aside the brush, and what I saw nearly took my breath away. It was an old, weathered headstone with a large cross etched into the marble. Only the cross was glowing a bright, vivid blue, like a neon light. The humming became much louder and had an eerie quality, as if it were coming from hundreds of voices at once. Overwhelmed by fear, I quickly retreated to the parking lot. I radioed the guard scheduled to relieve me and asked him to arrive early. I spent the rest of my shift in the cab of his truck. Although I do not think he believed my story, he stayed in his truck and avoided patrolling until the sun was fully up. A few days later, I gathered the courage to revisit the grave during daylight. As I suspected, in the light of day, it was an ordinary headstone. There was no name on it, only the cross. I examined the stone thoroughly to check for any hidden light sources or solar panels, but found none. It was simply plain, solid stone. The humming was gone as well. I eventually resumed my normal patrols, but I never experienced anything like that again. To this day, I still think about that night from time to time. It might sound improbable, and perhaps it could have been a hallucination or a trick of my tired mind, but I do not believe it was. I think it was real. Oh, perhaps a ghost or a spirit of some sort. However, I do not believe it was malevolent at all.
Story 2. Mysterious Outhouse.
My father served as a drill sergeant in the Taiwanese Marines. Taiwan has a long and turbulent history, and much of its land has witnessed violence under occupation. Rumor had it that his military base was built near a mass grave, and over time, several strange and unexplainable events occurred there. One morning, a soldier reported to my father looking exhausted and visibly shaken. The previous night, he had been on guard duty, overlooking the firing range. The targets on the range were a mix of clay and wooden figures, designed to resemble enemy soldiers aiming rifles. According to the guard, as he stood there, bored and staring at the range, he witnessed one of the clay figures suddenly lay down its rifle and say in a tired voice, "I am so exhausted." Overcome with fear, the guard fainted. During the evenings, when training was over, the sergeants had some free time. My father enjoyed snake hunting during dusk when snakes emerged from their burrows as the ground cooled. One evening, armed with a bag, a long stick and a flashlight, he ventured out into the fields near the base. As he wandered, he found himself approaching an old, abandoned outhouse far from the main base. As he got closer, he felt an unexplainable sense of dread. Something about the outhouse felt wrong. At that moment, his flashlight, pointed directly at the structure, suddenly went out. He checked the batteries and shook the flashlight but could not get it to work. When he turned toward the base, the flashlight flickered back on. Puzzled but curious, he turned toward the outhouse again, and once more the flashlight failed. After repeating this process a few times, my father decided not to push his luck. He calmly apologized out loud for any intrusion and walked back to the base. The base was surrounded by forests and mountains, typical of Taiwan's rugged terrain. One rainy day, the soldier was reported missing. As the day turned into night, a manhunt was launched. But the heavy rain and darkness forced the search to be called off until morning. When the soldier was finally found, he was huddled inside a damp cave, trembling and too frightened to speak. No one could determine what he had encountered, but whatever it was, left him so traumatized that he was transferred out shortly after. In another event, the base endured one of the most intense typhoons Taiwan had ever experienced. Typhoons are a common occurrence in the region, but this one was particularly destructive. After days of relentless wind and rain, the storm finally passed, and the soldiers emerged to assess the damage. One of the base's landmarks was a massive tree, hundreds of years old, which stood on a hill and sheltered a small Buddhist shrine at its roots. The storm had completely uprooted the tree, leaving its roots twisted and exposed. Remarkably, the shrine remained untouched. Even the delicate red silk draped over it, with nothing holding it down, had not moved despite the ferocious winds. The soldiers saw this as a powerful symbol of resilience and strength, a reminder that no matter how great the storm, their spirit would remain steadfast.
Story 3. Phantom of Shaft Alley.
Submariner here. Few things are as unnerving as wandering through the engine room from 11:30 at night to 5:30 in the morning while on watch. When the submarine is largely shut down in port, it becomes an eerily quiet place. Roving watches often rush through their log rounds, particularly in the lower levels where the silence feels oppressive. During one in port period, the boat was moored at Pearl Harbor, and several crew members began mentioning an inexplicable feeling of unease. I was on the mid-watch as the shutdown engineering officer one evening, when a senior chief came back to perform his routine tour at 3 a.m. We watched him walk past maneuvering on his way to Shaft Alley. This particular senior chief was the quintessential seasoned sailor, calm and collected. He often spent time sitting in the lower levels of the engine room, reflecting in solitude. What none of us anticipated was his sudden, frantic return to maneuvering mere minutes later. He burst in, his face pale and his breath shallow and rapid. The entire room froze. We sat upright, exchanging worried glances, bracing ourselves for what seemed like an imminent ship emergency. The senior chief collapsed into the engineering duty officer's chair, visibly shaken. Several tense, silent moments passed before he finally spoke, describing what he had just experienced in Shaft Alley. He said he had been sitting on a trash can, as usual, when a figure passed by him. Thinking it was another sailor, he called out. But as the figure came into view, he realized something was off. The individual was dressed in an old World War II era naval uniform, something no one on the boat would wear. Curious and uneasy, the senior chief followed the figure all the way aft. When he finally caught up, the man turned to face him. They locked eyes, and then, without a word, the figure turned and walked through the solid steel hull of the submarine, vanishing entirely. That was enough for the senior chief to leave Shaft Alley immediately. He swore repeatedly that what he saw was real, his tone unshakable. None of us doubted him. But I, for one, decided I was not about to leave maneuvering that night to investigate.
Story 4. Creature on Fort Irwin Road.
One evening, me and a buddy of mine, who was my platoon mate, were driving back from the mall in Victorville, California. As we entered the starting stretch of Fort Irwin Road, I noticed fresh, bloody tire marks leading off the side of the road directly into a cross, which was dated something like August 11th, 1989. That date stuck out to me because it was eerily close to our current date, August 11th, 2006. It gave me an uneasy feeling, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining things. About 20 minutes into our long drive down this isolated 2-lane highway leading into the vast, empty desert, I glanced over at my buddy who was driving and lip-syncing to some song on the radio. Then, suddenly, something darted out in front of us. We were traveling at about 75 miles per hour, and I barely had time to register what I saw. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a large humanoid beast covered in fur with a wet, hairy face. It looked directly at us, despite the speed we were traveling. The creature was tall, at least 7 feet, and walked on 2 legs. But its eyes, I do not know how to describe them. When it turned its body and I looked into its eyes, it felt as though time slowed down. Its eyes were not reflective, but seemed to emit a dead, pale light. They were voids, almost like they were staring straight into my soul. It was not a look of fear or aggression. It felt more like a greeting. My friend shouted in shock as the creature sprinted across the road and disappeared into the night. He thought we had almost hit a person, so we stopped the car and got out to check. However, there was nothing around. He muttered nervously. A large, hairy bird. No, not a bird. A bear? No, what was that? The rest of the drive to the base was silent. My usually talkative friend, Brian, was unnervingly quiet. When we got back, we told our squad members about what had happened, but no one believed us. Over the next few weeks, though, I began to hear murmurs from others who claimed to have seen similar things. Years later, after leaving the service, I did some research. I discovered native folklore from indigenous tribes that spoke of Sasquatch or similar creatures living in the barren salt flats. The stories I found online seemed eerily similar to our experience. To this day, my friend and I have never spoken about that night again. Whatever it was not something I can easily forget.
Story 5. Strange noises in the dead of night.
At the time, I was working nights in the munitions storage area, which was fenced off with barbed wire. The whole area was pretty spread out, with multiple buildings and large enough that you had to drive around to get to other buildings. Due to the nature of the job, the buildings were spaced out with clear space between them. The only people in the bomb dump on this particular night were the roughly 8 of us in my shop, and one guy in control that night. He was in another building, and we had a direct line to him on what we called the bat phone. More on this later. It was summer in South Carolina, about 2 or 3 a.m. and the air was warm and very still with absolutely no breeze. We had the break room door open while we watched a movie. We were on flight line support standby and nothing was going on. Now there was a rumor that the small building we worked out of had been built by German prisoners of war during the war. And I know for a fact that there were some there back then. The building was small, with a main break room, a small dispatch office through a doorway, and a couple of offices off of that one. There were 2 doors, one in the break room and one on the same side of the building in the dispatch office, roughly 20 to 30 feet away from each other. Both doors had push bars on the inside, but only the break room door could be opened from the outside, as the dispatch door's external latch was broken, and only the internal bar worked. Well, all of us, minus the guy locked down in the control building for security, were in the break room when suddenly a loud thump came from the dispatch door in the next room. It was like someone had rushed through, slammed the push bar, and the door swung open, then swung back shut after a couple of seconds with another slam. We all looked at each other like, what in the world was that? And started to check it out. We had flashlights in our crew books, so a few guys grabbed them and swept around the building from both directions. Another guy called the controller on the bat phone, who picked up and denied that he was playing any tricks on us. There was no way he could have done anything like that and made it back to his phone in time, let alone doing it without being seen or heard. Anyone with experience knows how sound carries at 3 a.m. in the South Carolina summer. You could hear the beeps from code keys being pressed hundreds of yards away, no joke. There was no way he could have gotten back to his building fast enough, gone through the halls, punched in his code, and made it to the phone in time. But the thing that really got me was that door bar. The door simply did not open from the outside, and we all clearly heard the bar get pushed in hard. The door swing open, hang there for a couple of seconds, then shut. And there was absolutely no breeze. And had there been, it would have blown past us sitting in front of the only other door. It was extremely strange. As an aside, there were random times when I would go to pick up a trailer or something behind one of the other shops at the far end of the bomb dump. And as soon as I stepped out of my truck to do my inventory, I would get a strong feeling of dread. I'm talking an intense sense of unease, as if something was right above and behind me and just hated me being there. It felt like seething anger, rage, and hate, and it wouldn't go away until about 15 minutes after I had driven away from that building. One night, another driver who had arrived shortly before I had for a trailer asked if I had a strange feeling there, which I definitely did, so I know I wasn't the only one who felt it. All of this was happening during the mid-shift, which was from 11 at night to 7:30 in the morning. I heard a few other people's stories about weird things that would happen at night, but since those weren't my personal experiences, I can't vouch for their truthfulness. The only other thing that happened to me there was that I swear I saw the clear silhouette of a person walking in an open field between storage units. As I turned to punch in my gate code, I distinctly saw the motion of 2 legs and an arm sticking out, as if someone was mid-stride. When I turned back, it was just an empty field. That one could have been my mind playing a trick. But man, that place could be absolutely terrifying. It's been nearly 15 years, but I still get chills thinking about it.
Story 6. Ghost of the Flight Deck.
I am currently stationed on an aircraft carrier commissioned in 1977. There is never a lack of creepiness on that ship at night. I work security on the carrier during the night shift, and we rotate between nights and days every so often. I remember one night, my friend was heading up to the flight deck with a rifle from where our armory is located on the first deck to the flight deck on the 4th level, which is a 5-story difference. It's quite a distance to travel alone at night. So he gets to a certain part of the ship that's almost pitch black, just 1 story down from the flight deck. And he hears footsteps behind him. He looks back, but no one is there. He picks up the pace, and as he does, he hears the same footsteps. He looks back again, and this time sees a dark figure about 30 feet behind him. At that point, his "I'm not dealing with this" switch flips, and he starts briskly jogging. He then hears the footsteps also pick up the pace and run after him. He sprints up the last flight of stairs to the flight deck and hustles over to where we are at the front of the ship. He's as pale as a ghost and tells us what happened. We stay away from that area of the ship now. Other than that, down on the 7th deck of the ship, the second to last deck before you reach the hull, there are munitions storage areas, essentially where we store bombs for the plane. Well, back in the day, a little girl fell down one of the ladder wells, which is a legitimate 6-story drop to the bottom. She ended up dying. There are chains and various other items that can be moved, and they say that at night, if you're not paying attention and zoning out, she'll come by and rattle the chains hanging from the ceiling and move things around. The fantail, which is an area on the outside of the ship, overlooking the water at the back of the ship, is home to multiple ghosts that play tricks on the 2 lookouts who stand watch out there. One of the ghosts is of a little girl, and you'll hear her giggling, followed by the sound of a bouncing ball hitting the deck, then a splash in the water. There is also another ghost that will approach you while you're nodding off during your watch. He'll be dressed in his uniform, tap you on the shoulder, and say, "Don't report this," before he jumps into the water. Aside from that, there's always a constant feeling of being watched at night, especially if you're alone in certain areas of the ship.
Story 7. Vanishing woman at Duke Airfield.
During my time stationed at Duke Airfield, an adjacent site to Eglin Air Force Base in West Florida, I experienced something that still lingers in my mind, even to this day. It was during my detachment with the Air Force Security Forces during the early stages of the Iraq War. The airfield, with its deserted and eerie atmosphere at night, always seemed to have an underlying sense of unease. One evening I was taking a break from my duties and was in the living quarters. The building was old, with narrow hallways and creaky floors that made the silence feel all the more oppressive. I had just exited the bathroom when I saw her, a young woman who seemed to be in a rush. She looked tired, with a disgruntled expression on her face, her hair a little bedraggled, and her clothing wrinkled, as if she had been through something difficult. I watched her for a moment as she turned and walked down the hall, heading toward the exit. Naturally, I began heading in the same direction, but when I turned the corner just seconds behind her, she was gone. I quickly made my way outside, thinking she might have just been ahead of me, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Perplexed, I approached my Air Force counterpart, who was patrolling outside the building, I asked him if he had seen a tired-looking woman come out just before me. He looked at me confused and said, "No, no one had come out." It struck me then just how fast she must have moved to disappear before I could catch up to her. The parking lot was empty, the area surrounding the building was silent, and there was no way she could have vanished that quickly. We weren't on the clock at the time, so my counterpart might have been preoccupied with his logbook or adjusting the radio, but it still didn't sit right with me. What made it all the more unsettling was that I couldn't recall hearing the door open and close as she passed through. The only sound I heard was the faint rustle of the night air. It was almost as though she had vanished into thin air. To this day, there's still a lingering doubt in my mind. Could she have been a ghost? Did I truly see an apparition? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I'll never know for sure. But there's a part of me that wonders if she vanished around the corner, never to be seen again.
Story 8. Demon in the Warehouse.
I have a friend who shared a story with me that he claims is classified, but whether it's true or not, it makes for an incredible ghost story. Here's the story as best as I can remember, though I may not do it justice since I haven't heard it in a few years. He was stationed at a military base in the Middle East, somewhere in a remote location. The base was surrounded by a wall with guard posts at various locations, and there were a few other spots where soldiers kept watch, including the barrack. There was also an old abandoned warehouse on the base, and the massive double doors were always kept shut. The soldiers had to walk past the warehouse whenever they switched posts. One night, while my friend was in the barracks, gunshots suddenly rang out. Everyone rushed to get their gear and figure out what was going on. After they realized the gunshots came from inside the base, they headed to the source. 2 soldiers were posted up by the warehouse, guns aimed at it, and they looked terrified. One of the warehouse doors had been pushed open just slightly. When the soldiers were asked what had happened, they said something large and dark had run inside the warehouse. After calming the soldiers down, they did a sweep of the building and found nothing. It took 2 soldiers to close the heavy door again. The next night there were screams coming from inside the warehouse. They did another sweep, nothing. The following night, more screams. By the 3rd night, another group of soldiers who were changing shifts opened fire. They described the same experience as the first group, something fast, too fast for them to aim at or shoot. The door was pushed open once again, and 2 soldiers had to shut it. After a few nights of this, and with the soldiers still mentally sound, a bigger investigation was set up. Special cameras were aimed at the warehouse entrance, and some soldiers were stationed outside to watch for any activity. One night, the door opened on camera, and a demon emerged, screaming loudly. The guards opened fire, but the creature sprinted back inside faster than anyone could keep up with. Both doors of the warehouse swung open, and the demon's screams echoed. More soldiers came and swept the area again. Nothing was found. Around this time, soldiers started putting some pieces together. They'd always known that the nearby village had a curfew, with no one allowed out after dark. Curious, they asked the villagers about it, and the villagers told them that there was a god of death in the area, and they dared not stay outside after nightfall. Not long after this discovery, a special team arrived with more equipment, including heavier firearms. My friend, equipped with special recording gear, joined the team. The doors to the warehouse were opened and the team set up inside. It was pitch dark, but they had the equipment to see. They formed a square with 4 soldiers. 4 hours passed with no activity. Then the soldier across from my friend made a hand signal. He was signaling that something was behind my friend. The soldier to my friend's right had nodded off, and the other soldier across from him was perfectly still. My friend turned around, crouching into position, ready to open fire with the soldier across from him. When he turned, he saw a humanoid demon, about 9 feet tall, with piercing eyes. The creature was menacing, and when they opened fire, it was so fast that it appeared to teleport to the side, then up the wall, until it was on the ceiling. The soldiers continued firing, but the demon kept reappearing behind them, putting them at risk. Eventually, the soldiers decided to leave, taking their equipment with them. The cameras, however, had captured everything. My friend was debriefed and instructed never to speak of it again. The building was demolished. The villagers later explained that the demon was tied to an old mass grave near the base, which was eventually exhumed, and the bodies were given a proper burial. I'm sure I haven't recalled every detail exactly as my friend told it, but his version had so much more detail. The way he tells the story is so convincing that it's hard not to believe him. But at the same time, the story is so incredible that it's almost unbelievable. I wish I could get him to write it out for you all, because it's truly amazing.
Story 9. Girl in the White Shoes.
I was stationed alone on watch in my company's barracks during Navy boot camp in Orlando. It was my responsibility to check all the windows, as the company commander liked to keep 1 or 2 unlocked to make sure we were thorough. This put me in the narrow space between the bunk beds and the wall, making it harder to see what was going on around the room. As I was doing my rounds, I caught movement, a flash of white down the middle of the open compartment. White shoes meant a new recruit, since the rest of us had already graduated to black Oxfords. I stepped between the racks and moved toward the middle of the room, hoping to see who had come in. But there was something off. The outside door hadn't opened, and I would have heard the door by the inside stairwell. The door to the laundry area was locked, so there was no way anyone could have come from there. Standing across the open area, near the other row of racks, was a girl with curly dark hair. She was dressed in the same female utilities as me, light blue shirt, black pants, and just like a new recruit, she wore white tennis shoes. She looked at me for a moment, but then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. There was no place for her to go, and no way she could have disappeared that quickly. We were in the middle of the compartment, yards from any door, with nowhere to hide. I only saw her for a heartbeat or 2, but it felt like an eternity. Years later, our new fireman recruit started talking about her experiences on roving patrol watch at boot camp. She said they kept finding a pair of white sneakers in the locked laundry room of an empty compartment. It freaked her out. She mentioned how the red lights always made the room look darker, and how they would rush through their checks and leave as fast as they could. They thought one of the company commanders was playing a prank. I asked her which building, wing, and floor. Sure enough, it was the exact same compartment where I had seen the girl.
Story 10. Ghosts of the Soviet War.
During my deployment to Afghanistan in 2010, I was stationed at a forward operating base nestled in the rugged terrain of the Panjshir Valley. The base was a former Soviet military installation abandoned after the Soviet-Afghan War and had a reputation among the locals for being haunted. One night I was assigned to guard duty at a remote outpost on the perimeter of the base. The area was eerily quiet, with only the distant sounds of the valley's wind and the occasional rustle of wildlife. As I sat in my observation post, scanning the surroundings, I noticed a faint glow in the distance, near the old Soviet barrack. Curious, I decided to investigate. As I approached the source of the light, I saw a figure standing in the doorway of the dilapidated building. The figure was dressed in what appeared to be a Soviet military uniform, but the attire was old and tattered. The figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. I cautiously entered the building, my flashlight illuminating the decaying walls and broken furniture. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. Spinning around, I saw nothing but shadows. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I quickly exited the building and returned to my post, my heart pounding. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day I mentioned the encounter to a fellow soldier who had been stationed at the base longer than I had. He told me that the building I had entered was known among the locals as the Ghost Barrack. It was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of Soviet soldiers who had died there during the war. From that day on, I avoided the area near the Ghost Barrack. The memory of the figure in the doorway and the chilling atmosphere inside the building stayed with me throughout my deployment. This experience remains one of the most unsettling encounters of my military service, a reminder of the lingering presence of the past in the places we occupy.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.